I'm Christina Davis, Director of the Program on U.S.-Japan Relations. It's wonderful to have you here. Thank you for coming on this rainy day for those who came in person. And thank you to those online who are staying dry. We are going to be talking today about the political economy of energy security and climate change response, looking at Korea and Japan in global perspective. Both the climate crisis and rising fears about energy interdependence amidst global tensions have put energy at the top of the agenda for national security of almost every country in the world. But of course, for resource-poor countries like Japan and Korea, energy has always held great significance. Both Japan and Korea have long given priority to giving development, energy resources, improving energy efficiency, and promoting access for companies and low affordable pricing for their citizens. From contracts to develop fossil fuel to nuclear energy development and investment in renewable resource technology, governments have been actively involved in energy policy. Japan and Korea have committed to achieving 100% carbon neutrality by the year 2050. Korea launched its Korea Emissions Trading Scheme in 2015, which made it one of East Asia's first to adopt a nationwide mandatory emissions trading scheme. Japan adopted its Green Transformation Basic Policy for Decarbonization Strategy this year. Governments have been offering policies to help support the consumer purchase of electric vehicles, investment in battery production, and of course the auto industries in Japan and Korea are actively engaged in steps to speed up their own transition to hybrid electric cars, as well as hydrogen fuel cell vehicle development. Japan was among the first nations to adopt a hydrogen strategy in 2017. Korea has also rolled out a hydrogen roadmap in 2019, setting targets for hydrogen transportation and energy sector development. These are really exciting policy innovations that are coming from both Japan and Korea. Now, of course, there are critics who say that despite these efforts, the governments are not doing enough. Yet here in the United States, I think we all admit there is much that can be learned from looking at the examples of policies taken by Japan and Korea. Indeed, during the Camp David summit this summer, President Biden joined with Prime Minister Kishida and President Yoon to call for trilateral cooperation for sustainable energy strategies. For us today, I'm really happy that we can bring to two of the leading experts to discuss these issues. We're going to be hearing from Seong-ik, who is the Director General of Korea's Ministry of Land, Infrastructure, and Transport. He is coming back to Cambridge, where he received his master's degree from the Harvard Kennedy School and the Tufts Fletcher School. After his master's study, he went on to receive a PhD from SAIS at Johns Hopkins University, studying under Kent Calder. And he has also been teaching at Yonsei University alongside working in government. So he is truly a public intellectual and a public servant. His book, Overseas Energy Investment of Korea and Japan: How Did Two East Asian Resource-Rare Industrial Giants Respond to Energy Security Challenges, published this year from Palgrave Macmillan. The book is really an impressive study that looks at how political institutions shape the different responses in Korea and Japan to the challenge of meeting energy needs of their growing economies over the past 70 years. It started as a dissertation, but has grown to bring in the wisdom of a government official, and is a wonderful contribution. I encourage you to take a look. After Seong-ik, we are going to hear from Phillip Lipscy, who is Professor of Political Science at the University of Toronto. He serves as chair in the Japanese Politics and Global Affairs and director of Center for Study of Global Japan. He is also coming back to Cambridge after receiving his political science PhD here at Harvard in the government department, studying with Susan Farr as his advisor. We're very happy that Susan can join us here today. He has published widely in international organization, energy, environmental politics, and Japanese politics. He is the author of the book, Renegotiating the World Order, Institutional Change and International Relations, published in 2017 by Cambridge, and is already well along the way to finishing a new book manuscript on the title of Institutional Politics of Energy and Climate Change, which examines political incentives that influence when governments can force costly measures for climate change mitigation on the public. This is going to be an exciting presentation. We are fortunate to have co-sponsors for the event by the Japanese Economic Statecraft special series. We are also benefiting from co-sponsorship with the Korea Institute, the Harvard University Center for the Environment, and the Harvard Undergraduate Japan Policy Network. Each of our speakers is going to talk for about 15 minutes, and then we'll open up for question and answer. Thank you very much. You'd like to go first.
Thank you for your wonderful introduction, which I ever heard in my life. Hello, my name is Seong-ik. I'm currently Director General at Ministry of Land, Infrastructure, and Transport. I got master's degrees and PhD degree in the US, as she explained. We have a short time, so I move to contents. Okay, here is Boston. Boston Marathon has been world best sports event in Boston, and where runners aspire to win for their national pride. In 1947, a Korean runner won the race. This was great news for Korea. Was congratulations. A nation just liberated from Japan in 1945. In 1951, Shigeki Tanaka, a Japanese runner, won the race, which became the hope for Japan because he was an atomic bomb survivor in Hiroshima. Maybe now for the Boston Marathon is one similarity between Korea and Japan. This story was born from the episode between Dr. Fukuyama and myself when we met at the PhD's third orientation session at SAIS. After saying hello, I told Dr. Fukuyama that I plan to compare Korea and Japan. And his answer was, so similar to compare. While some people who have seen the world macro see Korea and Japan as the same, such as using chopsticks or English phobia. But I could not agree with that intuitive thought. That was the start of this story. Let's look at the similarities. Both countries suffer from war, but they succeeded in economic development where the respective central government played an important role in, like it. And this was described by Chalmers Jones as you read. Informed network matters in social life. That's why you are here together. Both have a military alliance with the US. Due to lack of resources, both have to import resources from overseas. Also, both have strong affection to diaspora, Japanese in Brazil, Korean in Central Asia. But the difference is noticeable in their political structure, like I described in this map. Political structure where this is important because policies are decided and legitimacy is gotten. Let me explain in the order of background of this publication, summary of my book, and more on energy security. As you know, since the Russia-Ukraine war in February 2022, the energy market has become unstable. Saudi Arabia's decreasing oil production adds to the market instability, and this made more and more people are interested in energy security. Under the US-China rivalry, it seems that it has become more important to understand US allies, Korea and Japan. This book is about change, policy change. While Japan is known to gradual in policy change, Korea is known for its decisiveness. What would be a significant independent variable? In this book, I wrote that it is the number of veto players. My question is this in this book: why these two strong states, Korea and Japan, produce different outcomes in realizing public cooperation for overseas oil and gas production? This question comes from the fact that Japan's overseas oil and gas production, oil and gas are produced only by private companies. On the other hand, more than half of Korea's overseas oil and gas was produced by public corporation. This study explores the answer through the veto player theory. The definition of veto player is an individual or collective actor whose agreement is required for policy decisions. There are institutional veto player, partisan veto player, others, including interest groups, NGO or NPO, which is related to Dr. Susan Farr's academic interest. According to the theory, if there are more veto players, it is difficult to change policy. Therefore, in this case study, my hypothesis is that if there are more veto players, it becomes more difficult to establish or strengthen public cooperation. This picture is a reflection of the theory, which I draw by myself. We can identify veto players vertically and horizontally. For Japan, there are more veto players than in Korea. A noticeable difference is the role of LDP in policymaking with Park and Executive Council or Somukai. Another difference is the role of interest groups in policymaking. In comparison, you can see how different it is in Korea. Let us see 4+1 cases of attempt to establish state-owned oil companies. In 1960s, MIT's original idea, maybe here's some METI officials. MIT's original idea was to establish a state-owned enterprise to promote Japan's acquisition of equity oil, such as developed in Kafuji oil field by Japanese Arabian oil companies. However, final outcome was establishment of Japan Petroleum Development Corporation, JPDC, which supports the private sector with overseas oil private sector's overseas oil venture financial. This outcome is mainly attributed to interaction among large number of veto players, shown in this slide. Let's move to second case, Korea in 1970s. Korea's Ministry of Trade and Industry made effort to establish state-owned company and succeeded in establishing the Korea Petroleum Development Corporation. PETCO, current name is KNOC, in 1979. While original idea was to establish a state-owned enterprise to exclusively deal with oil stockpiling. In the aftermath of first oil shock, as shown in the slide, the proposal was expanded to SOE that was vertically integrated. This outcome was possible mainly owing to small number of veto players. Also, the ministry could succeed in realization due to the domestic oil fever, like left side of the picture, and Japan's delayed ratification of the Korea-Japan Continental Shelf Joint Development Agreement. Third one, this is Japan in the 21st century at the time of Koizumi administration. In Japan, the idea to make state-owned oil company was conceived again during the debt-ridden JNOC, you call it JNOC. JNOC debacle during the Koizumi administration. As a countermeasure to abolishment of JNOC, METI proposed a state-owned oil company to deal with important oil and gas assets inherited from JNOC. However, METI could not achieve it. The final outcome was to privatize Impex, one of the better performing subsidiaries of JNOC. In the face of complex political struggle, in particular, the oppositional left side, the oppositional Mr. Horiuchi, LDP Executive Council head, METI evaded difficulties by establishing quasi-SOE. Also, establishment of JOGMEC, it is similar public institution to JNOC, is another example that displays policy resoluteness. This one is the Korean case in the early 21st century. The Korean government made efforts to strengthen its state-owned oil company, KNOC, when it faced oil price hike, $100 per barrel in 2008. One key policy was to make efforts to increase country's oil and gas self-sufficiency ratio through overseas oil development, and state need to directly fund large investment to increase E&P assets of KNOC or KOGAS. KNOC's reinvigoration was possible thanks to a small number of veto players in Korea's policymaking after the ruling party won the general election. This is about the decade after 2010. On the one hand, the role of impacts in Japan's energy security has been stronger, and the outcome of its consistency is an increasing, the blue line, increasing trend in terms of Japan's oil and gas self-sufficiency ratio. On the other hand, Korea's energy security policy has fluctuated due to the changing levels of interest or indifference of political leaders through different administration. The result is different from that of Japan, as you see in the slide. This part is extension of chapter 3 of my book, about Korea-Japan agreement on joint development of continental shelf in the East China Sea. The agreement was effective since June 1978, and it will be terminated in June 2028 if there's a 3-year prior notice in June 2025. Korea and Japan have succeeded in evading conflicts for joint development of continental shelf in 1970s. Under Russia-Ukraine war, we have to enhance energy security through cooperation. Due to supply and price instability, Korea and Japan, which depended on energy import, needs to have their own minimum supply basis within the region. Therefore, I would like to ask you to think about extension of the agreement for enhancing energy security under this volatile situation. Regarding climate change response, Korea has successfully invited 2 important international organizations, Green Climate Fund, we call it GCF, and GGGI. This was possible thanks to strong support of our political leaders. It seems that this is also the outcome of policy decisiveness. Thanks for listening, and I will welcome your question. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Christina, for the kind introductions, and Shin and Jennifer for orchestrating my visit. It's always good to be back and see so many mentors and familiar faces. I used to have an office right across the hallway, and the seminar room was one where I had great memories because there is oftentimes free food after seminars. So, and of course to Dr. O, it's such an honor to be on the same panel. I did read his book, and it's very impressive, particularly when you realize that he had a full-time job as a government official pulling it together. I learned a lot from reading it, and it's my real pleasure to share the stage figuratively with him today. So I would like to continue the discussion to some degree where Dr. O left off and focus particularly on climate change. But I'd like to begin by talking about energy security and how decarbonization relates to energy security. In many ways, decarbonization can be thought of as essentially the holy grail of energy security for countries like Japan and Korea, which are very poor in domestic natural resources, particularly fossil fuels. If you can achieve decarbonization of your energy supply through transitions to renewables and nuclear, among other things, and electrify your automobiles, you've essentially reduced your reliance on fossil fuel imports from unstable parts of the world like the Middle East and Russia. You have created greater resilience to supply shocks like we've seen in the recent war in Ukraine. And increasingly, it will create stronger alignment and preferences with the United States, which is now essentially energy independent. It used to be 20, 30 years ago, the United States was also very subject to these kinds of shocks because the US was a net importer of fossil fuels, and that's not true anymore. And so to some degree, you can see a divergence in potential interest between the US and Japan and Korea. On the other hand, if this energy security vulnerability remains. So decarbonization from an energy security standpoint seems like a no-brainer to some degree. However, if you look at the performance of Japan and Korea, and I'll go through several of these. This is the Environmental Performance Index compiled by Yale University, and it ranks countries according to their climate policies. You see that Japan is essentially ranked number 85th. The US is 101st, and South Korea is 126th. And so these countries rank surprisingly low based on the actual implementation of climate change policy. This is based on things like the ambition of their climate targets, the degree of renewables rollout, the moves away from fossil fuels, and so forth. This is another high-profile index, the Climate Change Performance Index, put together by German Watch. These are the lowest ranking countries, right? So this is a smaller set of countries used here. Japan is 50th, the United States is 52nd, and Korea is right near the bottom here, right around Russia and Kazakhstan, right? And so, you can quibble with the methodology. Maybe these rankings are not giving, quite a fair share to areas where Japan and Korea do well. But the international consensus, based on very credible measures of climate change policy and performance, suggests that these are not countries that are doing exceptionally well. If anything, they're right around the performance of the United States, which is, as we know, not sort of a shining example of progressive climate change policy. And I could go through many charts like this, but this is just looking at renewable share of primary energy supply. You have leading states like Denmark, Germany, of course, has increased renewable share quite rapidly. And even China, of course, has pushed on renewables very dramatically in recent years. And Japan, the US, and Korea are lagging quite a ways behind. And of course, a lot of this is existing hydroelectric dams, capacity that existed before climate change became a major concern. So if you subtract that, the sort of degree of increase in renewables in Japan and South Korea looks quite disappointing relative to the energy security rationale for moving towards renewables, as well as our image of these as relatively technologically sophisticated societies embracing green tech and so forth. We have made, I have made along with several colleagues, a series of arguments about how political institutions affect the ability of countries to engage in transformational energy policies. And I'll point you to an article that we published recently in Science for the details. But basically, what we argue is that there's variation in how ambitious countries are in implementing energy system transformations in response to things like the oil shock in the 70s and climate change concerns in more recent years. And there are two mechanisms that we point out. There are some political institutions that allow for insulation of policymaking from potential backlash in society. I'll talk about the electoral system on the next slide, but things like relatively autonomous and independent bureaucracies. And there's also compensatory mechanisms. So can you provide benefits to the potential losers from the transition, coal miners, for example? And in some countries with robust welfare states or corporatist interest mediation, we argue there's a better platform for reassuring the potential losers that they will still be okay even after the country moves into a different energy regime. And the punchline here is that if these types of institutions are missing or weak, countries struggle to push forward with government-led transitions. And there might be a lot of policy volatility and so forth, but at the end of the day, the transition is primarily guided by market-based factors. Solar panels become cheaper, and therefore there's more adoption, for example. It tends to be slower than countries that do have these types of institutions. I'll talk a little bit more about electoral incentives, which is something that I'm looking at in my book manuscript. And so, the literature acknowledges that there's variation in incentives associated with different kinds of electoral systems. And the one that I focused on is the difference between relatively proportional electoral systems and more majoritarian or first past the post type of systems. And the argument is that proportional electoral systems tend to be more associated with incentives to target small organized interests rather than large sets of voters, and the ability to win elections with a small percentage of votes, as was the case with Japan's old S&T VMMD system, tends to create incentives to target narrow constituencies and interest groups. And these incentives, I argue, lead energy policy making in countries with PR electoral systems to essentially provide greater insulation when things like energy policy transitions are being considered, particularly from consumer backlash against high energy prices. And the policy regime tends to take the form of energy saving, conservation, decarbonization pushed forward through imposing diffuse adjustment costs on the general public, consumers. And then the revenues and rents that are raised from these policies are redistributed to organized interest groups, which are privileged in the electoral system and thus are able to deliver enough political support to the ruling party in power. And I argue in my previous work that Japan before the 1990s was the quintessential example of this. The highest electricity prices in the world, very high prices implemented after the 1970s oil shocks on consumers. And much of that revenue was redistributed to various support groups of the Liberal Democratic Party, the infrastructure sector, rural residents, etc. And it held together. Japan increased its energy efficiency, and the LDP was very safely in power. This is some cross-national variation. I can show you dozens of these charts, but I'll focus on a few since I'm time limited. So this is the adoption of national carbon taxes or emissions trading systems by a country's electoral system. You can see that basically countries with PR were much quicker and have adopted these kinds of taxes on the consumption of carbon much more aggressively than countries with authoritarian systems. Japan and New Zealand are useful cases because they underwent electoral reform roughly at the same time. And what you see is that in Japan, which switched from SN to MMD, which is relatively more proportional, to a majoritarian system, prices on gasoline and electricity have been falling consistently. And this is counter to the global trend, right? This is a period when most countries are raising prices to try to combat climate change. And New Zealand, which switched the other way, is basically seeing an increase in these types of energy prices. And you can do a deeper dive into the actual policy measures that these countries have implemented. So essentially, after electoral reform, much of the energy debate in Japan has focused on how different parties can lower energy-related prices for consumers. So one of the first things that happens after electoral reform in 1994 is the non-LDP coalition government under Hatta freezes increases in electricity, natural gas, and transportation charges. This government didn't do very much, but this is one of the things that they did. And Hashimoto and Koizumi similarly focused on how to reduce prices for various energy-related consumption. The DPJ government that I've written about quite a bit, very high-profile focus on the elimination of the temporary gasoline tax, highway tolls, right, things that are associated with energy inefficient automobile use. The Abe LDP, again, I've written on this, so I won't go into it in great detail, but a very strong focus on how to reduce electricity prices, for example, by weakening the feed-in tariff that was creating momentum for solar energy in Japan. And Kishida, most recently, one of his high-profile energy policy decisions was to subsidize wholesale gasoline prices in response to the war in Ukraine. So very consistently, there is essentially multi-partisan support for how can we lower energy consumption costs on the Japanese consumer. And it's very difficult to reduce greenhouse gas emissions when you're making it easier for consumers to use energy more liberally. That said, Dr. O and I have both focused on institutional variables, right? Veto players and electoral systems and so forth. But I do want to note that leadership certainly can make a difference, right? Institutions are not destiny, at least always. In Japan, some prime ministers have placed greater priority on environmental politics and climate change. Khan, under the DPJ, of course, sort of staked his political career on implementing a feed-in tariff that briefly created what some people call the solar bubble in Japan. Solar adoption took off quite dramatically. Suga, who ruled for a very short period, very high-profile announcement of a net zero 2050 target and more ambitious short-term targets, as well as an intention to move away from coal. And if you look at the next generation of potential LDP leaders, there might be some grounds for optimism, right? People like Kono and Koizumi seem to care more about climate change than the current generation of LDP leaders. However, and this is a caveat that I'll close on, it's not so clear that the next generation of Japanese youth and citizens are similarly enthusiastic. So this is a Cabinet Office survey on climate change concerns. And basically, the question was, how concerned are you about climate change? And it turns out that the most concerned people in Japan are people who are above the age of 70, and people who are between the ages of 18 and 29. Only 20% of Japanese are concerned about climate change. And if you do an international comparison, this is a Pew Global poll, the share of the public that is very concerned about climate change harming them personally during their lifetime. Japan was essentially the only country where that share declined between 2015 and 2021. So this is sort of very interesting, right? So what's going on in Japan? And so in some recent work, I've made the case that Japan is oftentimes a harbinger. Things that you see happening in Japan are oftentimes sort of reported as curiosities or even made fun of. And then 10 years later, the same thing is happening everywhere else in the world. And so I think very important questions this raises are what explains the decline in climate change concern among the younger generation of Japanese? And are there reasons to believe that this is going to become a general phenomenon in other parts of the world where things are happening oftentimes socially with a slight lag, as we see in other phenomena among the youth, like hikikomori and social care and so forth. And is there something that we can do about it? Regardless of what kind of political system you have, if the public doesn't care about climate change anymore, it's going to be much harder to move forward with measures to deal with the problem. So in conclusion, it's important to remember that decarbonization is not only environmental policy, which we care about, but it's also energy security policy, right? So if these countries like Japan and Korea want to put themselves on a more stable footing in terms of national security, decarbonization should be given greater priority. Domestic institutions affect the ability of governments to pursue energy system transitions. And I'm happy to explain some of the other mechanisms we've talked about in our research during the Q&A session. Decarbonization progress in Japan and Korea, I would say up to today, have been disappointing compared to international peers, as well as what we might expect from our understanding of the wealth in these countries, the technological sophistication, and so forth. And at the leadership level, it's clear that the world would benefit from the two leading democracies in the region stepping up and doing more in this area. In regards to Japan, I think the key will be top-down proactive leadership from the Prime Minister, especially, as well as building bottom-up public awareness and trying to reverse some of the apathy that seems to be building, particularly among the younger generation. So I will leave it at that, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you for listening.
Thank you both very much. You do a great job of taking one of the most pressing policy problems of the day and thinking about what do political science theories about institutions have to say about variation in responses. So these are really both great projects. They make me a little worried because I think democracy is not doing well. It seems that majoritarian politics in Japan pushed it away from a positive track and towards worse policies on climate change, and empowerment of the youth might make things worse on climate change. And in your analysis, to the extent we need a strong energy policy, involving more party committees and interest group consultation was a blocking force.
Yeah.
So in both the development of energy policies and decarbonization, we've seen some of the dangers of democracy. But of course, this is something we'll talk about more. I want to open up to questions from the audience. I'm sure there's a lot of interest. I'm going to start off with Kento Hara, who is coming to the program on US-Japan relations from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He's doing research this year on Japan, US, Korea, trilateral cooperation in an era of US-China competition.
Thank you for the introduction. My name is Kento. I got my bachelor in Tokyo University, and I studied for my master's program in Seoul National University. So it was really interesting for me to compare the two policies. My question is about the future role of the government in the field of energy security and decarbonization. And when we discuss these topics, I guess there are many actors, but the government has the big role in this field. And recently, it seems that the government is putting emphasis on this issue, especially regarding the name of the economic security and energy security. And so my question is, how do you see the future role of the government in both countries? And I'd like to ask both of you. Thank you.
Korea first. I think is that accurate information sharing is very important in implementing, persuading and implementing this, in particular, renewable energy policy. For someone, renewable energy is very fantastic one, but for others, it's just something inefficient. Even in Korea or in Japan, that kind of opinion diversion happen. So basically, we have to share knowledge and information and then decide where to go, the direction of policy. That makes lower the number of beta players. Dr. Christina has concern, and by sharing knowledge and persuading people, we can lower the number of beta players and then make some breakthrough for the more better future. Yeah, that's my opinion.
I would say a few things. I think both countries can focus, much like the United States, on things that are relatively feasible within their political constraints. And so subsidies rather than costs, right? So this is something that you see in the Biden administration's policies as well. So imposing costs is politically quite challenging under the current political systems, but subsidizing the rollout of renewables, electric vehicles, and so forth, may be more politically feasible. Of course, government debt is something that you have to consider as well, right? Throwing money at the problem is not necessarily always the solution. The other thing is technological development and certainly cooperation. I think the recent trilateral cooperation is useful. So international accountability is something that can matter, and institutionalization at the international level. It doesn't necessarily help, as we've seen from the UNFCCC process, right? Internationalization is not always the answer, but certainly I think the proliferation of net zero 2050 commitments owes something to international pressure and the attempts to create norms around what is appropriate for countries to try to aim for. So I would put both of those very high up. And like I emphasized in my slides, leadership does matter. And I think Korea, it's more challenging because you have fairly frequent partisan rotation in government, which is similar to the United States. In some sense, in Japan, this is within the LDP oftentimes, different prioritization of climate policy. So if the party can do more to try to create continuity and to put this higher up on the agenda, I think that could move the needle. Of course, having more robust support from the Japanese public behind such policies, more voters willing to vote on climate and environmental issues, for example, would also make a big difference there. So public education and information, I think, would be another important priority as well.
Can I add one opinion, my opinion, to Dr. Lipscy's comment? That is, normally when scholars see Japanese politics, LDP looks one entity. But in my study, LDP is not one entity. Seeing vertically, there's at least two, Park and Somukai. They have sometimes they have same opinion, but sometimes they have different opinion. They change policy direction itself. So I know LDP has been managed national governance for a long time, but that doesn't mean you can implement policy easily in LDP.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's my.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely correct.
Assistant Park?
Thank you so much. I so much enjoyed the presentations. The first comment would be directed at Phillip. You came off and sort of pessimistic at the end by worrying about young people not being committed to climate change. But it seems to me that the survey results should give us a lot of hope, because it's the over 70s who care about climate change. And that is the segment of the population that is growing in all countries. So then it'd be interesting to look at the over 70s in Korea and the US, and there too, would we find more support? So that's the first point. And the second point is, I'm struck by how right now climate change exists. Of course, international relations scholars study climate change, but it is not typically defined as security. And one of the things that happens when something gets redefined as security, it can be an override for the multiplicity of veto players, for example. It moves up on the policy agenda. We saw that in the late 1950s in the US with Sputnik. And as a response to that, there was worry that the developing countries would follow the leadership of the Soviet Union. And then suddenly foreign area studies got redefined as security, and money just was pumped into area studies. And I studied the Hausa language. Hardly you would think a major security concern a language. In many languages, in other words, all over the world, got redefined as security. So my question is, do you see any signs of that happening?
I'm sorry, could you clarify?
Mitigation,
Yeah.
That it be treated as a national security issue.
Climate change issue, you mean?
As a national security issue. In other words, ratchet it up on the agenda as a priority from the standpoint of security.
Okay, Korea first. In my opinion, climate change can be based on energy security issue, because climate change itself causes problems in many sectors, so which inevitably require multiple sectors cooperation and response. And also the climate change has two kind of action for us. One is increasing renewable energy to lower the CO2 emission. Second one is climate change response, like making dam or to protecting people current natural disaster like flood. So those actions requires a lot of money, a lot of investment. For that reason, I think climate change need to be on the table of security. That's my opinion.
So on the question about demographics, so this is not something that's widespread. So typically, as you might expect from a theory of preferences as you age, it tends to be younger people who are more concerned about climate change because they're going to be impacted. The impact of climate tends to happen over time. And if you're 70 plus, realistically, you have 20 years, 30 years left in your life. And maybe you can weather the impacts of climate change. Whereas if you're 20 years old, much of your life is going to intersect with the period when climate change seriously intensifies. And so I think the story with Japan is puzzling. I don't think it's good news because I don't expect 70+ people in Japan to become climate voters. To say maybe they're concerned about climate change, but their primary interests are things like how much am I paying for electricity, pensions, and so forth. And so I find it quite unlikely that you'll see the sort of preference intensity and passion to mobilize 70+-year-olds in Japan as a core constituency for climate policy. And in many ways, if you look across the world, it's the youth that are out there campaigning, gluing themselves to paintings and so forth. And that seems to be somewhat absent in Japan. So it is curious, and I would personally like to know why we observe this anomalous trend in Japan, because in many ways it's surprising. But I do worry that what we see in Japan could be the future in other countries, as we've seen in so many other cases. On the security issue, I think there would be, there's a strong argument to think about decarbonization as an energy security issue and a national security issue. But I don't think typically that's been the case, right? So environmental policy is typically handled by a different set of bureaucracies than those that concern themselves with certainly national defense. METI for a long time, of course, has thought about energy security issues. But if you look at the position of METI within the Japanese political system, METI's position tends to be that we need to balance climate change response with economic growth and making sure that our businesses remain competitive internationally. And so, it's difficult for economic ministries to take the lead on this kind of policy transition. And within Japan, it tends to be the Ministry of Environment that favors more proactive action on climate, but the Ministry of Environment has traditionally been very weak. And this is true in many countries across the world. So, you could think of it partly as a bureaucratic politics. And so, one leadership initiative that might make sense in a lot of countries would be, let's try to elevate the authority of environmental ministries to try to move policy making forward. So, makes sense. Thank you.
Or as you say, bring in the leadership at the top level. So if cabinet-led policy making is increasingly important in Japan, having environmental issues be cabinet-level decisions.
Absolutely.
And we have many questions. Okay, so I will ask everyone to be short with one question. If you have a second question, you can get back in the queue, and we'll keep our answers short.
Can the ones online ask a question as well?
Yes, I have my online audience as well, and so I will take a couple more in the room before I go to online. Yes.
Thank you very much for great presentations. I have a quick question to Professor Lipscy. Your expression about carbon tax assumes that the objection mainly comes from the general public because they have concerns for higher electricity prices. In the case of Japan, it seems that the objection has come mainly from the business sector, mostly from the manufacturing sector, because they have concerns for higher electricity prices. So I'd like to have your comment on this. Thank you.
Yeah. Should I answer individually?
Maybe we'll collect a couple, that way we can work through quickly.
Sure.
Yeah. Hi, my name is Taegyeon. I'm a PhD student in the government department, and my question is about how Japan and Korea and other countries in general have to navigate through the current geopolitical situation, especially when a lot of oil exporting countries and their ships are under sanctions, and they are really concerned about this geopolitical risk. So basically, there are multiple policy objectives, but in securing this minimum level of energy supplies, it is kind of a goal that conflicts with a longer term carbon decarbonization goal. So my question is how countries, including Japan, Korea, can navigate through this geopolitical situation. Thank you.
Why don't you answer those two, and then I'll go online.
Okay, great. So on the opposition to carbon tax, certainly there has been opposition to high energy costs from energy intensive businesses, and this is sort of a universal issue. What I find in my research is that there is very little variation according to electoral system on this type of opposition, which is to say industrial opposition is fairly consistent regardless of the political institution in a country. And in Japan under the old regime, what the government did was there tended to be a different rate for electricity prices for wholesale use, for example. So industry tended to benefit from cheaper electricity prices compared to your average consumer. Of course, if you want to address climate change, you do need to create incentives for businesses to reduce their consumption of energy as well. And this is indeed something that is contentious, particularly in a globalized world where if you impose costs that are too high on the businesses within your own borders, they may very well choose to relocate to a different country where carbon taxes are much lower. So this is something that international negotiation or one policy tool that's been discussed oftentimes is some kind of border adjustment tax to even out the costs. And so there are ways to address it, but it's certainly sort of an ongoing issue in Japan as well as other countries. Thank you for the great question.
Geopolitics.
Yeah. Very important and difficult question. And for me, even for environmentalists, the role of fossil fuel cannot be neglected, at least in a few decades, when the productivity of renewable energy reach at some reasonable level. So the reason I raised the issue in my presentation about the Korea-Japan agreement on joint development of continental shelf in the East China Sea is that under current volatility of energy market, especially fossil fuel market, Korea and Japan have to secure minimum level of self-development of oil and gas for that within the region, and for that the joint development of continental shelf it will be a good one of good solution of in that difficult situation. Second one is nuclear power plant. Even though there is some concern about it, but still we cannot neglect the the efficiency of nuclear power plant as a clean energy. So in Korea, nuclear power plant is quite emphasized in energy production. So in the transition period to renewable energy production, we have to secure energy supply, fossil fuel energy supply, and nuclear power plant and electricity generation. That's my opinion.
And online, we have a question from Diego Osorio, who says, if we need the good intrastate structural buy-in for valid, viable energy policy, what are the recommendations you could suggest for North American context, mindful of the differences? So given our political institutions in the United States or Canada, how would you recommend an energy policy that would be sustainable? And he notes that we're all aware that it's a common urgency and emergency that we face. That's our first online question. Second, from Shinju Fujihira, he comments, Dr. O's argument seems related to Dick Samuel's business in the Japanese state with regards to underdevelopment of public corporations in Japan's energy sector. And he invites you to say a little bit more about whether public corporations are good for energy policy and climate change mitigation. So I think in order of time, I'm going to ask you to give advice to the United States and Canada. And I'm going to ask Dr. O to answer the question about are public corporations good for energy policy?
So I mean, what I would say here is that the United States has suffered from political volatility on energy policy going all the way back to when Jimmy Carter put solar panels on the roof of the White House and Reagan came in and removed them as one of his first acts of being president. And you've seen very similar things going on every time there's a transition from a Democratic to a Republican administration. I do think it's still important for Democratic governments, as Joe Biden has been doing, to push forward, because as you make investments in clean energy, you start to create interest groups and constituencies that support further action. It's still not going to be as steady as other countries where the policy regime allows for very consistent policy and thus gives you a longer time horizon for investments and so forth. So the US is working with a very significant disadvantage in some sense, but I do think it is still meaningful to try to push as much as you can when you're able. The other thing I would say is, in a market-based transition, which is basically where the US usually is, removing impediments to green investment is important, right? So this is true in Japan as well. One of the problems with installing new renewable capacity in Japan today is NIMBY issues that essentially local people are opposed to wind turbines blocking their view of the ocean or solar panels cutting down trees and things like that. Jack Hyman's at USC has a good paper on geothermal energy being blocked essentially by people who own hot springs, onsen, right? And so kind of dealing with deregulating and allowing the market to function in cases where market mechanisms are moving towards renewables would be something that I think both the United States and Japan and certainly Korea could focus on.
And since you're in Canada, how is Canadian politics doing?
That's another story.
Or what should it be doing?
I would say it's very similar actually in terms of the political institutional context. I would offer the same set of answers for Canada as well.
Yeah, my turn. And about public corporation, the public corporation can have roles to play when private sector capacity is weak. So in that regard, if the private sector's capacity is strong, the role of public sector can be limited to kind of financial support, like JOGMEC. In critical mineral resource development, Japanese private companies are very capable in exploring and development of critical mineral resources, but they still face the volatility of resource market. That's why JOGMEC tried to invest more financially to support those private sectors activities. Second one is about urgency or political decision or security-based assessment. That is, sometimes commercial reasoning is not so effective from the perspective of security. During my research, I found that even private companies got financial support from the public. It sold for if the selling is better for taking it as a asset, that which can be different from national security perspective. So if there's urgency or there is some security-based assessment, public sector has more role in participating in development of resources, including fossil fuel or critical mineral. That's my answer.
Thank you very much for your presentation. As you showed during the presentation, the European companies and countries good at the green energy compared to Japan and Korea. And I think that the European countries also good at using the high standard, environmental high standard as an economic tool. Could you explain why they can do such, take such policy, and why Japan or them cannot do, they take that policy?
Just so I understand what high standard?
The high standard, environmental high standards, the emission of greenhouse gas and the efficiency of fossil fuel.
So it's not a specific policy you're talking about, but the general policy.
Generally, yeah.
I mean, so, my argument here is that many European countries have the right kind of political institutions to either insulate policymaking from potential backlash, but also to compensate the potential losers, right? So you have interest group intermediation that looks very different in Europe compared to the United States or Japan. And we have welfare states. So if you lose your job in a coal mine, you're a little bit more confident that you're not going to be immediately in poverty. And so, I think the institutional context is important. The fact that there is a European Union and, the European Union itself, I would argue partly because it's composed of states like this, has helped to, from a top-down perspective, push many of these countries forward. And it's an interesting counterfactual to think about, well, if Japan was part of something like the EU, would it have made more progress? And I suspect the answer is probably yes. And so, if you have a very strong international organization like that, unlike the kinds of international organizations Japan and Korea are part of, that may certainly move things forward. It's a complicated question, but those would be sort of immediate answers that come to my mind.
Yes.
And thank you for the presentation. And I think the supply of reusable energy is unstable. So Japan and Korea cannot rely on this energy because Japan has Iran and Korea have no reliable country next. So and moreover in Japan, many people are against the nuclear power plants. So in this situation, what kind of energy Japan and Korea should choose in this age?
Dr. O?
Both Korea and Japan, some people say emphasize the inefficiency of renewable energy. I know, but it's also true that renewable energy produce less or almost no CO2. So we have to, if we think about consider the climate change as a very important issue, we have to think about renewable energy as one source of energy production. The problem is how the demand supply gap in renewable energy can be overcome. That is, normally we say ESS or hydrogen can contain the energy produced by renewable setting. That's why I said before that we have to share information, what is strong point and weak point of renewable energy, And if we have to implement more renewable energy, how to overcome that kind of difficulties or weak points of renewable energy. Without that discussion, there's also polarization on energy policy. That's why I mentioned that. Second one is a nuclear power plant. Yes, nuclear power plant, electricity production by nuclear power plant produce some concern. But it depends on people's opinion. In Korea, still nuclear power plant looks reasonable choice as a electricity production because it produces electricity in a reasonable price and clean and in a clean way. That's why nuclear power plant is emphasized in current administration, I think. For Japan, it's difficult to mention what Japanese people's thought. Maybe.
Well, there has been recent polling suggesting that Japanese people are somewhat supportive of nuclear for the first time since Fukushima, and Kishida has come out saying we're going to restart and even consider building new nuclear power plants. I think the LDP has always been pro-nuclear, and one of the interesting things about recent Japanese politics is that hasn't really hurt them very much. You would think that after a major disaster like Fukushima, being the only pro-nuclear party could potentially harm you. But going back to Susan's point, Japanese voters are not single-issue voters, and it turns out that nuclear is not something that many Japanese voters are willing to use as a decisive question in choosing who they vote for. So I'm skeptical in the Japanese context that nuclear will grow dramatically, but in the medium term, certainly nuclear will be part of Japan's energy mix. And if Japan is to achieve its climate targets, I don't think you can abandon nuclear and get there at the same time. So realistically, making sure that your nuclear regulation is good and that accidents like Fukushima, which was completely avoidable, right? It wasn't like this was sort of an act of God and completely something that they couldn't have dealt with, right? If there were just a few things different, like the backup energy generators were on a hill instead of underneath the ground where they got inundated, it wouldn't have happened. And so, making sure there's a policy regime to avoid disasters like that, but continuing at least with some level of nuclear capacity is probably the best path for Japan.
But it's great to have these conversations about trade-offs across different policy mix, everything from nuclear pros and cons to renewable pros and cons, and too often they're taken in isolation. The oil tanker spills harm the water, and nuclear wastewater harms the water, and considering all of the risks and what can be done for risk mitigation should be part of these conversations. International treaties would be nice, but we haven't been able to get any international global governance regime. I want to take two last questions before we close. So just very short questions. Yes, Amano-san?
Hi, so my quick, sorry, I just want to get back to Christina's point, like, is democracy good institution for this? She's in particular, I'm interested in under what conditions horizontal accountability through the horizontal accountability through the executive constraint, which means the veto player, is not good accountability mechanisms for any policy like energy policy. So I understand like it's really not great for deciding the better maximize the social welfare on the energy policies.
Before you answer, Higashi-san and back.
My name is Daisaku Higashi, a professor at Sophia University in Tokyo. I really appreciate your presentation. My question is that always I argue in my publication, like a book, TV appearance, and the TV newspaper interview, that one of the big reasons why Japan is so delayed in developing a renewable energy is kind of obsession with a nuclear power plant. And I think this, I'm not quite sure how you accept my assessment, but I thought that this idea or my assessment could be consistent with the Dr. Lipscy's argument on the democrat or public institutions, and also Dr. O's argument on the veto players. Thank you.
I can go first.
Closing remarks, yes.
Yeah, on the democracy versus autocracy question, I think China's, success in ramping up renewables creates a misleading impression because China is a very unusual autocracy on this. And most of the studies I've seen that compare environmental performance of democracies and autocracies suggest either there's no difference or democracies do slightly better. If not better on policy outcomes, at least rhetorically, democracies seem to be more committed to dealing with environmental issues and climate change compared to autocracies. So I would caution against thinking about, oh, China's doing so great, what we need is environmental autocracy and the world would be such a better place. Typically, what happens in autocracies is the dictator is not very interested in climate change, and that's that, right? Sorry, remind me of the second question. Nuclear, yes. So I do think, my assessment is similar in the sense that I think the electric utilities like TEPCO and KEPCO in Japan have been resistant to the renewables transition and much more invested in their existing nuclear power plants and fossil fuel-based power plants. So I do think this is a factor. It is somewhat surprising that after the Fukushima disaster and the delegitimization of the electric utilities that has still continued. I often think of it as a little bit of an accident of history where the DPJ government was in power when that accident happened. And so the LDP was able to come in and basically reinstate the status quo and revert some of the DPJ's changes on things like nuclear regulation and the feed-in tariff and so forth. And if the LDP had been in power in 2011, the outcomes might have been quite different.
Both of you questions are about democracy and new policy direction. So basically, accountability and policy decisiveness looks opposite way standing in opposite way, but in this situation, what we have to add is government's role as a persuader to lower the number of veto players. In the past time, the elitism or isolated government bureaucrats are they got full power to decide what to do, and they just implement without people's consent, even the legislatures support legislative consent, because they used to be in the past time, they used to be just follow. But now it's different. Normal people can get their information from their cell phone, iPhone or Galaxy. And National Assembly, the legislature, member of legislatures, they also became more capable in academic perspective or practitioners' perspective, and they are not simple follower and not anymore. So now governments have more work to do. That's different from previous work. Previously, their work is research, make policy and implementation. That's it. But now we have to one more work. Before policy making, we have to check like Nemawashi style policy making, and after making policy, we have to persuade why this is needed, why we have to go this direction. And with that, we can make more reasonable policy setting. Majority of people can get agree. That's how to overcome the concern you mentioned. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you both very much. I hope that the discussion today has contributed to persuading our audience and those who read your books to think more deeply about these issues. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom.